So if you picked two people at random out of the population and had to guess who was more aggressive, and you guessed the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. That's about the magnitude of the difference between men and women.
Well, that's 60-40. It's not that much of a
That's
margin,
right.
is it?
That's exactly right. But, and this is where things get more sophisticated. All right, so then imagine that you had to pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person and put them in jail, which is what we do. They're all men. So even though at the midpoint, the difference between men and women isn't that extreme, at the extremes, the difference is extraordinary. And most of the activity, or much of the activity in complex situations, happens at the extremes. So men are more interested in things than women are, and women are more interested in people than men are, on average. And those differences are largest in Scandinavia, by the way. So there's no evidence that they're socioculturally constructed. And one of the consequences of that is that if you leave men and women to make free choices...
Well, let's put aside that Scandinavia is not just one country, and it has lots of different cultural, political differences within
Sure,
Scandinavia.
but the point is that, and this is the fundamental point, is that the more egalitarian the country, the bigger the differences between men and women. The bigger.
I have no idea how one could possibly conclude that.
You rank order countries by their sociocultural policies from egalitarian to non-egalitarian, and then you look at the magnitude of the differences in temperament in men and women in those countries. And you do those analyses
depending on
and
your
you publish
definition
them.
of temperament.
Yeah, but there isn't a definition of temperament that exists that's valid outside of the psychometric community.
Well,
and so this is
in that case,
well-established
we're
science.
locked into a particular definition within what you call the psychometric community. And other people may simply say, look, I experience the world very differently, and I have evidence from my dealings, whether I'm a man, whether I'm a woman, whether I'm looking at how we get along together and what we do to improve matters, that doesn't conform to that. I mean,
the question is then, what is the evidence? The fact that someone has an opinion about it isn't relevant. The relevant issue is what the evidence suggests, unless you're willing to throw out the scientific enterprise, which I wouldn't recommend.
No, I'm not. I'm certainly not doing that. But I do think that to pin it to a narrow definition of psychometric testing,
it's not narrow. It's 5-dimensional.
Recursive.
It's 5-dimensional. It's not narrow. The whole world only has 4 dimensions. 5-dimensional model is actually extraordinarily sophisticated.
If it's got 4 dimensions and then we're into 5, that's magic.
Well, you have 5 dimensions. There's many multi-dimensional spaces, but reality itself has 4 dimensions, and there's plenty of complexity.
Let's come back to your evidence. Absolutely come back to evidence, but also to what you make of the evidence, because trading.
All I make of the evidence is that there's multiple reasons for gender differences.
So what do we then do with this? Let's say that we decide that there are differences, and we can argue whether it's about the average. I mean, who is the average woman? Am I the average woman? Are you the average man?
Some ways probably, in other ways not.
Right. Okay. Good to know. So what do we do with this? So it takes us into this argument about what progress should look like. And the gender pay gap was a good example of that. As you say, lots of different ways of describing it, lots of different approaches to dealing with it. The challenge to you would still be, I think, do you think that the situation that we have is broadly fair in workplaces, and that women are self-selecting out of progress up the pay chain, rather than being, to an extent, under the pressure of child rearing that is not probably accounted for, or that they're not properly helped with? Is it really all about their decision, or might structures not play a role here? One doesn't have to be completely mad to think this, right?
No. What you have to be completely mad is to reduce the whole thing to gender and to assume that it's a consequence of oppression. There's multiple factors at play, and prejudice is one of them. The question is to what degree prejudice, or arbitrary categorization, let's say, and the lack of provision of opportunities for women is contributing to the pay gap, and to what degree other factors are contributing. So there's other factors. Like I said already, men are much more likely to do dangerous jobs. They're also more likely to do jobs that scale. So, for example, because women are more interested in people on average than men are, they tend to work in people-oriented enterprises, and those are hard to scale. And because you can't scale them, it's harder to multiply the income. Men are more likely to move than women are. Men are more likely to take on trade positions. They're more likely to work with heavy machinery. They're more likely to work outside. All of these things add to the...
But if you cashed out, sorry to interrupt you there, but if you took out working with heavy machinery, which some women do, but more, we will say, right, more men will elect to do that. There's quite a lot of things in there where they're being nudged. We're all nudged throughout our life to certain choices. We don't have to accept the nudge. But then would you accept that women have lacked opportunities that they've lacked. The nudge has not operated in the same way. So for you to say,
Over what time span?
Well, you can choose your time span. Say 100 years if you like.
I would
don't
say
really mind the time span. The point is, are women, in a sense, already going through a number of gates in life, and some of them are wider than others?
It's complicated. I mean, I think men were directed down narrow pathways in ways that women weren't. So, for example, they were much more likely to be conscripted into wars, for example, which actually happens to be a non-trivial phenomena because it resulted in the deaths and the demolition of many men. And so both sexes are subject to the arbitrary strictures of culture. And perhaps you could argue that women had the worst time of it, although it's not that easy an argument to make. I would say that the extra pressures of child rearing and the inevitability of pregnancy played a very large role in that, and we didn't deal with that effectively till 1960. And so one of the things that I really don't like about the women were oppressed by men throughout history narrative is the fact that both men and women were terribly oppressed by nature throughout history, and that's not being factored into the equation. And I think that what men and women did for most of history, the decent ones anyways, was team up and partner up and try to make life the least amount of miserable for both. And yet we read this narrative backwards and we say, well, the reason that men and women weren't operating equally in the sociocultural landscape was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That accounts for a tiny fraction of it or some proportion of it. But it had much more to do with the fact that everyone was poor and miserable and that women were locked into a reproductive cycle from which they had no practical escape. And we didn't fix that till the 60s.
What might irritate some working women, indeed some women, whether they work or not, is you can either sort of look at something like the gender pay gap and sort of pick apart how difficult it is, or you could say, well, let's try to fix this and let's have an intelligent argument about how we best fix this thing. And the argument that women are self-selecting out of the workplace becomes a bit of a roadblock.
Yeah, but women do self-select out of the workplace all the time. Well, if you look at the legal profession, that's absolutely crystal clear. Women are overrepresented at the lower ends of the legal profession, but they stop operating at the high ends in their 30s, and it happens in all sorts of professions, and there's good reason for it. I mean, what happens? Well, because women in their late 20s tend to decide that they don't want to work 80 hours a week. They would rather have a family and devote some time to that, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Another possibly reasonable thing to do is for the child-rearing roles of men and women to come more into balance than allowing, with some trade-offs, life being imperfect, allowing women to come back earlier into the workforce.
Well, yes, but that also assumes that what women want to do is come back. That's the argument
that you put. You put it on the women.
Well, no, not at all. That's not a fair characterization in the least. Your argument is predicated on the idea that the advantage to women is in coming back to the workplace. But many women decide, especially once they have children, that having their children and spending time with them is actually more valuable than going back to the workplace. And that's a reasonable thing to decide. In fact, you might think it's the intelligent thing to decide.
Well, a lot of women do then come back into the workforce and their pay is then lower.
Well, that's something that you had mentioned earlier. And the fact that women pay a disproportionate price with regards to long-term career earnings if they become mothers. That's a very narrowly focused problem, and it's a problem that might need to be addressed. But that's not the same as the gender pay gap. It's a much more defined problem.
Yes,
and part of the problem is, how do we best...
Can we get you to carry a banner for that part of the feminist crusade, then?
Not if it's part of the feminist crusade, no. Because that would mean I'd have to carry a banner for what I regard as a rather reprehensible ideology. But I do...
Overall, feminism is a reprehensible ideology?
Well, what percentage of British women regard themselves as feminists now?
I don't know.
7%.
Well, it depends how you ask a question, I would guess.
Well, no, the reasonable measurements of it estimate there's something like that. It's a very small percentage.
Really?
Yes, really.
Well,
it's a very small minority, even if it's not 7%. And part of the reason for that is...
Would that make it inherently wrong? I mean, I'm not sure it's 7%. And, but I think that's one on which we could all go and bandy a bit of research on the isms. But would it necessarily be such a bad idea? I mean, you must have sometimes stuck up for minority rights, even if the idea is right.
Well, first of all,
as you say in your book, stand up
aren't
for what
a minority,
you believe.
by the way. They're actually a majority.
Precisely so. So in that sense...
They're not minority rights that we're talking about here if we're talking about female rights.